Westward Expansion, 1800 to 1875. In 1800, the Pimeria Alta region of New Spain remained mostly populated by Native Americans, not Spaniards. At the Presidio at Tucson, the Spanish military commander mounted nearly a dozen forays against the Apache between 1783 and 1785. He then displayed the impaled heads of Apaches on the palisades of the Presidio walls to thwart future attacks. The governor at Santa Fe, Juan Bautista de Anza, was a former soldier and frontiersman, and he used alliances between Navajo and Apache to ward each other off. The Apaches were notoriously independent, and De Anza took advantage of feuds between clans to quell the violence against Spanish settlers. Others, like Viceroy Bernardo de Galvez, used bribery with food, defective firearms, and alcohol to attempt to make the Apache dependent on Spain. These combined tactics were fairly effective, and by 1793, 100 Western Apache bands left their territory and sued for peace at the Presidio at Tucson. They settled along the Santa Cruz River and formed the Apache Manso, or the tame Apache, becoming farmers and remaining part of the Tucson community for nearly 50 years. They tended crops in the valley and moved to the surrounding mountains to hunt game and gather agave and cactus fruit. But of course, not all Apache clans decided to give up raiding for agriculture. When Apache raids came, both Hispanos and Odom took refuge behind the Presidio walls, abandoning their fields and unable to protect their herds. Tentatively, small Spanish settlements began to flourish in the southern region of Arizona. In 1800, the total non-Indian population stood at between 300 and 500 people at Tucson, 300 to 400 folks at Tubac, and less than 100 living at Tumacacori. At this time, Tucson and Tubac were just small villages, clusters of flat-roofed adobe buildings. The Spaniards farmed and lived in a subsistence economy, much like their neighbors, the Odom. They grew wheat, corn, beans, and squash, and they tended their cattle, horse, and some sheep in the San Pedro, Sonoita, and Santa Cruz valleys. Many prominent Hispano families with names like Ochoa, Elias, and Ronstadt received substantial land grants from the government to settle in the region. They would play important roles in business and ranching and continue to influence politics in the region for several generations. They also established Catholic schools and public schools, built theaters, churches, and published Spanish-language newspapers. And then a stunning series of events outside of the Southwest occurred which would change life along the riverbeds of the Pimeria Alta. First, in 1803, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France decided to sell his claim in the New World to the fledgling United States government. President Thomas Jefferson engineered the Louisiana Purchase that allowed the United States to control 829,000 square miles of land that adjoined the northernmost territories of New Spain. And this action put land-hungry Americans right next door to the Spanish Empire. Deserters from the U.S. Army, runaway slaves, and debtors found a haven in Spanish-controlled East Texas, which was so far from Mexico City, over 1,000 miles, as to be almost ungovernable. Comanches controlled most of central Texas, and further instability came in 1810 when the revolution in Mexico began. After 3 centuries of misrule by arrogant and often incompetent Spanish-born royal officers who overburdened local residents with taxes, Mexicans revolted. In 1821, Spain realized it had lost this long battle, and Mexico declared independence and began the difficult process of forming a new government and constitution. but because Spain made little effort to educate the poor citizens of the New World and kept them from important governmental roles, it was very difficult to find effective leadership among the largely illiterate and politically inexperienced population in early Mexico. The revolution in Mexico destroyed silver mining and bankrupted the national treasury. Funds dried up for the missions and presidios, and the Apaches that had not turned to farming noticed that a power vacuum existed, and they increased their raiding activities. Prior to the revolution, Spain mandated that outlying provinces could not trade with the Americans or the French in Louisiana, so all goods came from Mexico. But independence from Spain meant open trade, and Anglo entrepreneurs and trappers poured into New Mexico from the United States. The Santa Fe Trail opened up, bringing much-needed cloth, metal tools, books, and even the first printing press to the region. With the new goods came new ideas about religion, government, and democracy. According to historian Howard Lamar, quote, "The Santa Fe traders have broken the cake of custom, caused two distinct peoples and cultures to blend into contact, and have prepared the way for political as well as economic conquest of Spain's northernmost provinces." End quote. The earliest Anglos to arrive in Arizona were trappers. Their headquarters was in Taos, New Mexico, and from there they wandered along the rivers of New Mexico and Arizona looking for game, mostly beavers, since beaver hats were at the height of fashion in the United States from the mid-1920s to the early 1940s. There were fortunes to be made on the frontier. A beaver felt could fetch as much as $4 to $6 on the American market, and the animals were found in abundance along the rivers in the Colorado Basin and the Gila River watershed. Although the Mexican government viewed these Anglo-American and French-Canadian adventurers suspiciously, there was very little they could do to stop their activities. These hard-drinking and uncouth mountain men often married Mexican women, thus becoming naturalized citizens of Mexico. Most failed to obtain a license to trap, required by the Mexican government after 1824, and they smuggled furs out of New Mexico illegally. The mountain men and traders explored in areas the Spaniards barely had a glimpse of over their 2+ centuries of rule. They established routes that would someday become roads and highways. In 1822, Ewing Young, a carpenter from Tennessee, led the first wagons west across New Mexico and once was one of the very first Anglos in Arizona, trapping beaver along the Salt and Verde rivers. He experienced ambushes by Apaches and had his pelts impounded by the Mexican government because he operated without a license. In 1828, Young returned to the White Mountains with a 19-year-old Christopher Kit Carson and 16 other men. They journeyed west to California, where they delivered pelts to a sea captain who then took them to market. Carson would continue to trap throughout the mountains of the West, using Taos as his base. He was born in Missouri in 1809, the 9th of 14 children, and after losing his father in an accident when he was 9 years old, he was forced to go to work to help support the family. He traveled west at age 14, looking for adventure. In 1842, he became a guide for John C. Fremont on his first expedition to map the western trails to California. He became a national hero for his pioneering work, with Fremont exploring the West. Another important trapper in Arizona was Bill Williams, a tall, thin redhead who carried numerous scars from all the fights he had been in. He was born in North Carolina and was believed to be a preacher. Old Bill was well known as a good shot with a rifle and an excellent trapper, and he spent almost his entire life with Indians, especially the Utes, and over the course of his lifetime married several different women and mastered their native languages. He was a big spender, who would only come into town occasionally and then spend all of his hard-earned money on alcohol, gambling, and carousing, and then return to the mountains to trap. He also worked as a scout for John C. Fremont's fourth expedition in 1848 through the Rocky Mountains, and received national notoriety in articles in Cosmopolitan and Century magazines. There are many places named for him in Arizona, including the town of Williams, the Bill Williams National Wild Refuge, and Bill Williams Mountain. Bill Williams River, the Bill Williams Mountain Men continue to this day to dress up in buckskin trapper costumes and appear at parades and other functions in the state, representing the legacy of these pioneers in Arizona. Not much is known about the lives of these men who trapped beaver, primarily because they lived in remote areas, cut off from civilization, and they were often skirting Mexican law. But James Ohio Patty wrote a very interesting narrative of his exploits in the Southwest during the 1820s. He spent his first winter of 1825 to 26 trapping along the San Francisco, Gila, and San Pedro rivers with his father. In his outrageous accounts with bears, javelina, panthers, and Indians defy imagination. He was the first Anglo to write about Arizona, and his tall tales were just the first of many that would establish it as a place that was wild and savage in the minds of Easterners. The mountain men traded with the Apaches and Navajo, giving them guns and gunpowder in exchange for mules and horses. This transformed the balance of power in the Southwest, allowing the Apaches to gain the upper hand once again after decades of relative peace. In the late 1820s, Apaches began to burn and run off settlers in the southern part of the state. Tubac was abandoned for a while after an attack in 1849. Relations between Mexicans and the Odom began to sour as well, because the mission system withered away because funds were not coming from the impoverished Mexican government. By 1843, the fields and churches founded by Kino were deserted, leaving no buffer between Hispanic settlers and Indian land. Mexico granted land held by the Indians to Mexican citizens to repay them for military service, causing dissension and even warfare with their former allies, the Odom. Tucson's Mexican residents were frustrated when military commanders who had seized their land and left them without drinking water, fields, or any means to survive. Trappers and traders reported back to residents of Missouri that Mexico had little control over the Southwest and had alienated many inhabitants. They noted the weak allegiance residents of New Mexico had to their home country and the vast emptiness of Arizona. They were also usually the first to discover gold nuggets when traveling along riverbanks. The intelligence they provided paved the way for the eventual American conquest of the West. While all this was going on in Arizona and New Mexico, there was a growing movement in Texas to free itself from Mexican rule. The growing Anglo population demanded more and more rights and eventually declared Texas an independent republic. In 1845, John L. O'Sullivan, editor of the New York Morning News, editorialized that it was America's, quote, manifest destiny to overspread and possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty, end quote. After an attempt to buy California and New Mexico, the United States government declared war on Mexico in 1846. Kit Carson became a guide for the Army, leading soldiers into Arizona along the Gila River. But he avoided Mexican towns of Tucson and Tubac, so there were no battles during the Mexican-American War in Arizona. A second expedition had a far-reaching effect. It was composed of a company of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, who wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States of America. The Mormon battalion forged a wagon trail across the Great Plains and into the Southwest, led by Lieutenant Colonel Philip St. George Cook. They were the first to encounter the Mexican population in the San Pedro and Santa Cruz valleys, where they were treated warily but peacefully, exchanging clothing for much-needed food stores. No battles or deaths occurred during the Mormon battalion march, but trails were marked for future roads that would cross through Arizona. General Winfield Scott seized Mexico City in 1847 after pitched hand-to-hand combat, and the United States and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which gave Mexico $15 million in exchange for Texas. The United States also annexed New Mexico, California, and Arizona north of the Gila River. Arizona was not really desired by the United States. It was simply a territory that would provide access to the big prize, a transcontinental nation that linked Pacific to Atlantic oceans. The following year, when gold was discovered in California, the rush was on to find the quickest path to the west. Most gold hunters went on the overland trail or by ship around South America, but about 50,000 miners traveled through southern Arizona in the winter months. In 1853, President James Buchanan sought to expand U.S. holdings from Mexico. He wanted a U.S. port on the Gulf of California, and he wanted to try and purchase most of northern Mexico, the states of Sonora and Chihuahua. The leader of Mexico at the time, Santa Anna, would not agree to these terms and only would sell the strip south of the Gila River, which included Tucson, Tubac, and Tumacacori, to the United States for $50 million. And thus, Mexican Arizona became part of the United States. In 1856, U.S. troops first rode into the southern part of Arizona, uncertain how the local inhabitants would react. Many Mexican residents expressed hope that perhaps some order might be reestablished. Also, many Apache clans were relieved that the Americans had defeated their enemies, the Mexicans. In 1835, the state of Sonora had passed a law offering a $100 bounty for the scalp of any Apache warrior. 2 years later, the state of Chihuahua offered a similar amount for any warrior, $50 for a woman and $25 for the scalp of a child. The Apaches were happy to see the Americans wage war on their enemies, the Mexicans, but they were not quite as approving of the peace treaty that promised the United States government would restrain Indians from raiding Mexico and would repatriate any captives to the Mexican government. The Apaches were trying to avenge the scalpings of the Mexicans, and they wanted free access to go down on raids south of the border. But the peace negotiations would not allow this, nor could Americans do much to halt Mexican assaults on the Apaches. The United States government had truly inherited a tumultuous situation. In 1850, Mexicans slaughtered the family of Geronimo while they were on a peaceful mission led by Mangus Coloradus. Geronimo lost his wife and 3 children. He later said, quote, "I was never again contented in our quiet home. I had vowed vengeance upon the Mexican troopers who had wronged me. And whenever I saw anything to remind me of former happy days, my heart would ache for revenge upon Mexico." With the Mexicans conquered, many Apache clans, in exchange for payment, allowed some Anglo settlers on Apache land. However, there was a problem to this arrangement. According to anthropologist Richard Perry, quote, The Apache saw the reciprocal exchange of gifts and hospitality as a social interaction. Anglo-Americans tended to interpret such encounters as transfers of exclusive rights to property. End quote. So this misunderstanding often led to warfare because the Apache did not understand they were giving up the rights of their land in exchange for payment. After the Mexican-American War, Tubac quickly became leading city in Arizona. Charles Poston was prospecting in the area with an engineer by the name of Herman Ehrenberg, waiting for the completion of the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. Poston had found some silver ore around Tubac, but when he went to Colorado City to cross the river, he did not have the $25 he needed to pay the toll. He ended up staying in the Presidio at Tubac when the Mexican soldiers evacuated. At this time, there was no established government, and the nearest court was in New Mexico. There were no white settlers north of the Gila River, neither Hispanic nor Anglo-American. Over the next few years, Charles Poston purchased over 17,000 acres of ranch land and started a small, thriving community at Tubac, establishing the Sonora Mining and Exploring Company in 1855 with $2 million in capital from Eastern investors. Poston hired hundreds of miners to prospect for mineral wealth, and he himself became the de facto government in the territory, overseeing weddings and baptisms and administering the law as judge and jury. Historians have described Poston as a man with a volatile mix of ambition, promotion, and exaggeration, and he is often called the father of Arizona. Tubac only prospered until the Civil War, when the soldiers at Fort Buchanan were called away to the eastern battlefields, and the town was once again unprotected from the Apache. Later, when the railroad was built, it was routed through Tucson to the north, and silver was discovered around Tombstone in the early 1880s to the east, and Tubac lost its importance. But Poston assumed other positions in Arizona, including becoming the first Indian commissioner in the territory. The U.S. military quickly established two posts prior to the Civil War: Fort Buchanan on Sonoyta Creek in 1856 and Fort Breckinridge on St. Pedro River in 1860. But there was insufficient manpower to protect local settlers from attacks. Meanwhile, Army personnel, including Captain Lorenzo Sitgreaves and Lieutenants Emil Whipple and Joseph Ives, started to map out wagon roads and railroad routes across the Colorado Plateau. Mexican and American freighting companies hauled most materials in and out of the territory. The wagon trains were pulled by mules and oxen and traveled over rugged terrain. The military noted that it cost 2 to 3 times as much to supply the men at their posts in Arizona than it did in Kansas because of the cost of the transportation. Because it was so difficult and expensive to freight cargo through the territory to provision forts, some fairly unusual alternatives were employed. Before Jefferson Davis became the leader of the Confederacy, and while he was still with the United States War Department, he initiated an effort to bring camels to the Sonoran Desert to haul goods. In 1856, 33 camel and a half a dozen Arab handlers set sail from various ports in the Middle East and arrived in Texas after a 3-month journey. The most famous of the handlers, Haji Ali, or Haj Ali as he was known among the local residents, was especially patient and skilled with his difficult charges. He helped the military train the camels to carry heavy loads of supplies over the rugged terrain, and he led a caravan that crossed from New Mexico into Arizona through the Painted Desert, over the San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, along the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and down to the banks of the Colorado River. The strange sight of the caravan intrigued the local Mojave Indians, and they were inspired to design an intaglio in the shape of a camel in the desert near Needles. Although military commanders like Ned Beale were very impressed, the handling of these camels and what they could do in the desert, local cowboys who were used to cattle found it impossible to learn how to herd these temperamental beasts. Eventually, the army gave up on its experiment. Once out of commission from the army, the camels were allowed to roam wild, adapting to local plants like cacti and mesquite, and they continued to reproduce. The last of the camels was spotted as recently as the 1940s. Another important form of transportation was started in 1858 in Arizona. The Butterfield Overland Stage Line ran through southern Arizona. It was started by John Butterfield, who spent $1 million to build a company that could deliver mail from St. Louis to San Francisco twice a week, a 2,800-mile trip. He ran anywhere between 100 and 250 coaches, which cost $1,300 and weighed 2,500 pounds each. The outfit required 1,000 horses to keep it running. In the summer, the route went north, but in the winter, the line went through Texas, and Tucson and Yuma were the main towns in Arizona along the route. The coaches went at full speed with only hurried stops at stations to change horses. Riding on the stagecoaches was a rugged trip. Lots of bumps and bounces. Mark Twain recalled his trip west on an overland stage in his book Roughing It in 1861. When offered something to drink by the station keeper, Twain said, quote, "It purported to be tea, but there was too much dish rag and sand and an old bacon rind in it to deceive the intelligent traveler," unquote. The fare for eastbound passengers out of San Francisco was $100, but $200 from St. Louis or Memphis going west, and it had to be paid in gold. Meals were 75 cents to $1 extra, and as Mark Twain remarked, they were not very good. The baggage allowance was 40 pounds per passenger, a figure that is echoed in today's baggage allowance for flights. But the overland stage was primarily for the mail, not passengers. In the month of July of 1860, over 6,000 pieces of mail were carried from San Francisco. To avoid holdups, the line refused to carry payrolls or valuables. Cochise, a powerful Apache leader, agreed in 1857 to allow the overland mail line to pass through Apache territory unmolested. There were still many other dangers, including accidents involving overturned stages and ornery animals, but the main complaint was the endless tedium of the long, dusty trip. The route through Arizona was vital to the development of southern Arizona, and when the Civil War interrupted service, many observers believed that Arizona settlements could not survive the blow. River travel was also very important, and the Colorado River became a crucial port of entry into California and Arizona. From 1854 until 1858, Yuma was called Colorado City, and then after 1858 until 1873, it was named Arizona City. Finally, in 1873, the territorial legislature changed the name to Yuma. The city, located on the Colorado River, was the entryway into California to the west. It was the first new non-Indian settlement to appear in 100 years. Other ports along the Colorado River included Ehrenberg, La Paz, and Hardyville. It was so much easier to bring a steamship up the Colorado River than it was to bring a mule train across the territory. The only problem was this important strategic location was initially controlled by the Quechan and Mojave Indians, both human-speaking tribes, who had spent considerable energy of the previous decades warring with Spanish settlers and other Indians, especially the O'odham on the Gila River. 80 years earlier, the Quechan had thwarted Spanish attempts to create an easier entrance into California, and now, unhappy with the thousands of American gold seekers who trekked across their lands, they continued to control the Colorado ferry during the height of the gold rush. In 1852, Major Sam Heintzelman established Fort Yuma on the California side of the river and wrestled local control from the Quechan. As Anglos took over the ferry business, the Indians were displaced and only found jobs as pilots and woodcutters. That same year, 1852, the first steamships plied their way up the Colorado River. Before dams were built, the Colorado was difficult to navigate. The water levels fluctuated wildly before dams controlled the river flow, and waves could be 8 feet high. Often sandbars appeared that stranded boats, and only the hardiest of adventurers traveled here. Martha Summerhays was the wife of an Army officer who traveled with her husband on assignment throughout Arizona in the 1870s, and she recorded her memories in a book titled Vanished Arizona. This is an excellent book to read to understand how difficult it was to live in Arizona at this time. Summerhays believed, quote, the Rio Colorado deserved its name, for its swift-flowing current sweeps by like a mass of seething red liquid, turbulent and thick and treacherous. It was said on the river that those who sank beneath its surface were never seen again, and looking over into those whirlpools and swirling eddies, one might well believe this is to be true. Few Anglo women ventured into Arizona until the 1880s because the fear of Indian attacks was high and accommodations were so rough. Summerhays recalled the ordeal in the summer heat on a boat on the Colorado in her book Vanished Arizona. Quote, and thus began another day of intolerable glare and heat. Conversation lagged. No topic seemed to have any interest except the thermometer, which hung in the coolest place on the boat. And one day when Major Worth looked at it and pronounced it 122 in the shade, a grim despair seized upon me, and I wondered how much more heat human beings could endure. She spent a summer in the town of Ehrenberg on the Colorado. Her observations on the tiny town reflect her Eastern Anglo biases. Quote, of all the dreary, miserable-looking settlements that one could possibly imagine, that was the worst. An unfriendly, dirty, and heaven-forsaken place inhabited by a poor class of Mexicans and half-breeds. End quote. Summerhays was not alone in her bleak assessment of the conditions in the Arizona Territory. General William Tecumseh Sherman remarked, quote, we had one war with Mexico to take Arizona, and we should have another to take her back. End quote. However, the draw of gold would bring new waves of immigrants despite the inhospitable environment. In 1858, a gold strike was made at Gila City, near the junction of the Gila and Colorado rivers. The short-lived boom brought in merchants, gamblers, traders, as well as miners. But then followed a period of warfare that stymied further development in Arizona. And as the North and South battled over slavery, and Native Americans and the U.S. military battled for control over Arizona. Although most of the Civil War was conducted east of Arizona, the conflict had an impact because it required Washington, D.C. to recognize Arizona as a territory separate from New Mexico. Jefferson Davis, now president of the Confederacy, viewed southern Arizona as a path for his armies to reach California ports, as well as a place to exploit the mineral wealth of the West for the benefit of the South. He launched a military campaign into southern Arizona in July of 1861, forcing the Butterfield overland stage route to be abandoned, just as northern troops were evacuated out of Arizona and into New Mexico. President Davis created a territory called Arizona that was separate from New Mexico and put Lieutenant Colonel John Baylor in charge as military governor of the southern half of Arizona and New Mexico, with his headquarters at Tucson. President Abraham Lincoln was forced to respond to this aggression on December 29, 1863, by proclaiming Arizona a separate territory belonging to the Union and naming Prescott the capital. Residents of Arizona had previously sought territorial status separate from New Mexico in 1856, but were ignored in Washington, D.C. until the Civil War forced the issue. In the spring of 1862, at Picacho Peak, located just north of Tucson, 14 Union and 10 Confederate soldiers, all in scouting detachments, engaged in a 90-minute battle that left 3 Union soldiers dead. Although more skirmish than anything else, this is considered the westernmost battle of the Civil War. But the most important action occurred thousands of miles from Arizona, where politicians and military commanders made the decision to pull most of the troops out of the region's forts, relinquishing military control of the region. Violence escalated quickly between the native Athabascan people and the United States military. By 1863, many officials responsible for Arizona were openly advocating genocide against the Apache and Navajo. First, let us look at the Diné, or Navajo, who resided in the Four Corners region around Canyon de Chelly. The Navajo had a fairly sedentary culture and planted extensively, but still occasionally rounded up horses, cattle, and sheep from Hispanic or Anglo settlers. Navajo war leader Manuelito was hunted by Army Colonel Dixon Miles, and in 1860, Manuelito nearly overran the U.S. forces stationed at Fort Defiance. While hostilities escalated, U.S. Brigadier General James Carleton, from his headquarters in New Mexico, commissioned Christopher Kit Carson, the famous trapper and scout, to round up the Navajo and remove them to a remote spot on the Pecos River in New Mexico known as Bosque Redondo. Carson had maintained cordial relations with local tribes, and he had married 2 different Indian women over the years, but he had to follow General Carleton's orders. And the orders read, quote, "There is to be no council held with the Indians, nor any talks. The men are to be slain whenever and wherever they can be found. The women and children may be taken prisoners. I trust that these demonstrations will give those Indians a wholesome lesson." End quote. Most of the Navajo men were killed by Carson's soldiers, and then they destroyed about 2 million pounds of food supplies, including all of the Navajo livestock. Then the survivors, about 8,000 starving women and children and elderly men, were rounded up and forced to march 300 miles in blizzards to Bosque Redondo. Please recall that we talked about in the last lecture how important the land was to the Navajo. It was a sacred place where their ancestors are buried, and the holy ones would watch over their people. In the following account from Howard W. Gorman, a Diné elder, we're going to hear the stories of the Long Walk of 1864 from a Navajo perspective. Quote, "The Long Walk to Fort Sumner. What was the cause of it? It began because of the behavior of a few Diné. A handful here and there, riding horseback, killed white people and others that were traveling overland and took their belongings. So the soldiers, commanded by Kit Carson, were ordered out. Carson was nicknamed Red Clothes. A man named Doubleface, a very stubborn man, known as a thief and a killer, killed white people. And he and his group took their property. Today they would be referred to as gangsters. Unexpectedly, Red Clothes' soldiers arrived, destroying water wells, contaminating them, breaking the rocks, edging the water holes, of filling up the holes with dirt so they became useless. They also burned cornfields and orchards of peaches. That is what they did to us unexpectedly and unreasonably, because most of us were not harming anybody. From Fort Defiance, the Navajos started on their journey. That was in 1864. They headed for Fort Wingate first, and from there they started on their long walk. Women and children traveled on foot. That's why we call it the Long Walk. It was inhuman because the Navajos, if they got tired and couldn't continue to walk farther, were just shot down. Some wagons went along, but they were carrying army supplies like clothes and food, so the Navajo were not cared for. They had to keep walking all the time, day after day. They kept that up for 18 or 19 days, from Fort Wingate to Fort Sumner. On the journey, the Navajos went through all kinds of hardships, like tiredness and having injuries. And when those things happened, the people would hear gunshots in the rear. But they couldn't do anything about it. They just felt sorry for the ones being shot. The Long Walk was not a solitary journey, but over 50 separate trips with groups of between 20 and 2,000. At Bosque Redondo, the Navajo were joined by the Mescalero Apache, who had also been rounded up by the military. Smallpox epidemics ravaged the starving survivors, and the Apache and Navajo fought amongst themselves. Insects ate their crops, and Comanche raiders stole their livestock. In the winter of 1865, many of the Mescalero Apache escaped in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, the government tried to move the remaining Navajo further east to Kansas or Oklahoma, but Diné leader Barboncito told the Americans, quote, "I hope to God you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own," end quote. And he eventually convinced military commander William Tecumseh Sherman in 1868 to allow the Navajo to return to their traditional homeland in Canyon de Chelly. The 5,000 who survived were allowed to return, but only received about 1/10 of the land that they had previously held, and none of it contained good grazing land or water. In a treaty, the Navajo promised not to carry firearms, not to conduct war on the United States, and to send their children to schools built by the whites. In exchange, the Navajo were promised 2 sheep per family and food supplies for the winter. Unfortunately, the United States government did not live up to its end of the bargain. Famine was unavoidable because their fields had been destroyed and livestock killed, and most of the sheep were not delivered by the government. In 1875, the United States government, through the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, launched a reservation system that was a slow death for many Native people. It was believed that this would be a temporary solution to care for the Indians until they could be fully assimilated to Anglo-American life, learning English and learning how to farm and converting to Christianity. But most indigenous people had lived in the mountains where there was ample fish and game and water, and now they were forced to produce most of their own food on the most barren of lands. Epidemic disease, coupled with malnutrition, killed many. Corrupt Indian agents sold rations meant for the Indians to Anglos. European settlers often encroached upon reservation boundaries, taking land away from the Indians. Although the Long Walk and the death of so many Navajo was a great tragedy, at least their reservation was located on the traditional land, and they were allowed to return after only a short absence. However, over the years, Anglo settlers encroached on their territory, and they lost much of what was originally their property. Because the Navajo felt squeezed for space, they encroached on land traditionally controlled by the Hopi. The Hopi were the only people not forcibly removed from their homelands, but the government did not set up a formal reservation for them until 1882, and by that time, much of their land holdings had been given away to others, including the Navajo. This set up numerous quarrels with the Navajo that reverberate to this day. However, the Apache tribes fared much worse than the Navajo or Hopi because of the defiant stance they took against American settlers. The Western Apache tribes in Arizona took advantage of the vacuum left when most U.S. military troops left to fight in the Civil War battles of the East, and raiding against settlements increased. In 1861, First Lieutenant George Bascom met with the Chiricahua leaders, Cochise, at Apache Pass to discuss a raid on a ranch near Fort Bowie and the kidnapping of a young boy named Mickey Free. Cochise had been a woodcutter at the Apache Pass stagecoach station of the Butterfield Overland stage line. He had not led the raid, but he agreed to negotiate for the boy's release. But Bascom refused to release Cochise and his family members, holding them hostage. Cochise escaped from the tent that they were meeting at, and 3 bullets hit him. But the rest of his party was not able to escape and continued to be held hostage. Cochise seized an Overland stage employee and offered him an exchange for his family. But Bascom refused and instead hanged 6 Apaches in what would become known as the Bascom Affair. A series of bloody attacks followed, and by one historian's account, 150 whites died in 60 days. When Union General Carleton passed through the territory in 1862 with his 3,000 troops searching for Confederate troops, he engaged Cochise's Apache warriors at Apache Pass. Carleton was able to disperse many of the Apaches, but Cochise continued to hide out with roughly 200 followers in the Dragoon Mountains of southeastern Arizona for the next decade. Raids continued, and the military established Fort Bowie near Apache Pass to handle the subsequent campaigns against the Apache. Mangus Colorados, in 1863, was lured to a peace discussion. He was the father-in-law of Cochise. The military commanders maintained he was shot while trying to escape during the peace discussions, and an army surgeon cut off his head and boiled it in a pot to be studied by scientists and to become part of a lecture exhibit. His son-in-law, Cochise, and Geronimo, a nephew of Cochise, thought this was the greatest wrong ever committed by whites against their people, and many raids followed. But in the 1860s and 1870s, there was just too much terrain and too few soldiers to capture Cochise or any of his followers. The problems continued. In the winter of 1871, a group of Pinal and Aravaipa Apaches settled near Camp Grant, near Tucson, in an apparent truce with the United States military. As you know, the Apache were fiercely independent clans, and they were not beholden to each other, something that few U.S. military commanders understood at this early point. There were other clans in the neighborhood that continued to raid settlements in southeastern Arizona, and many Anglos falsely believed the Apache groups living peacefully near Camp Grant were responsible. On April 28, 1871, a group of approximately 150 men, mostly prominent Anglo and Mexican members of Tucson society, joined by numerous Tono O'odham Indians, attacked the Apaches living at Camp Grant. In 30 minutes, they had brutally raped and murdered about 100 Apaches, mostly women and children. 23 Apache children were taken captive. Only 7 adults survived. Politicians and the public in the East were alarmed by what they called the Camp Grant massacre. Within a year, 100 men were put on trial, charged with 108 indictments for murder. The trial lasted over a week, but focused almost entirely on previous Apache raiding in Arizona territory, which angered local residents. After 19 minutes of deliberation, the Tucson jury read a verdict of not guilty. The reaction to the massacre by officials in Washington, D.C. was to switch commanders, and General George Crook was brought in to persuade many Apaches to surrender, including Cochise. Congress appropriated $70,000 to collect the Apaches on reservations and provided them with subsistence if they agreed to refrain from hostilities. In 1872, Cochise negotiated a treaty with the United States military. He and his people were facing assaults from all sides. Scalp hunters and soldiers from Sonora and Chihuahua, Mexico, Odom parties seeking revenge, and even the Manso Apaches who were bankrolled by Tucson business leaders. Cochise finally sat down with government representatives in the Dragoon Mountains. His sister, a 50-year-old widow who was his most trusted advisor, also attended. It was noted by one American present that her, quote, independence and force seemed to justify this faith in her ability, end quote. The government agreed to let Cochise and his people remain on their land at Apache Pass. "Give me that," he said, "and I will see that nobody's property is taken by Indians." Unfortunately, much of the Chiricahua raiding in Sonora and Chihuahua continued because, as Cochise put it, quote, "There are many young people whose parents and relatives have been killed by the Mexicans, and now these young people are liable to go down from time to time and do a little damage to the Mexicans," unquote. Cochise was able to keep the violence to tolerable levels, but after his death in 1874 and a change of U.S. military command, the truce broke down. The government ordered the 4,000 Chiricahua Apache to the San Carlos Indian Reservation along the Gila River, a barren wasteland. With few rations and denied basic rights, the Apaches rebelled, and hundreds left, led by their new leader, Geronimo. Crook returned to assume command, convinced Geronimo to surrender again in 1884. But in a little over a year, he fled once again with several dozen men and 100 women, finding refuge in the mountains of Sonora, Mexico. Who was this man, Geronimo, who has become such a legend in American history? Was he a murderer who, quote, ought to be hung, end quote, as most Western newspaper editors demanded? Geronimo was probably born in the 1820s in southeastern Arizona near present-day Clifton. He spoke Spanish, and his mother had a Spanish name, Juana, although she was a full-blooded Apache. There is speculation that she may have been a Spanish slave. His name means one who yawns, but he was always called Geronimo by the Mexicans and even by his own people. The origins of the term are hard to know, but perhaps come from a pitched battle he was in with the Mexicans early in his life, when the soldiers yelled, "Ciudadano, watch out, Geronimo." Perhaps because they couldn't pronounce his name, or perhaps because they were calling on St. Jerome. Whichever the case, it stuck, and Geronimo became the battle cry for the Apaches. During World War II, American paratroopers used the word as they dropped out of planes into combat. Army agents and government officials who dealt with Geronimo felt he was treacherous, but that he was also very courageous and determined. He was not a chief, but rather a respected shaman with great power and hence an important leader within his clan. After the murder of his wife and children by Mexican soldiers, he discovered he had received a gift of power, which came suddenly and unexpectedly. It was the life force of the universe, he later recalled, and it sought individuals through which to work. Its nature and the manner of its coming varied from person to person. In a dream, it said, "No gun can kill you. I will take the bullets from the guns of the Mexicans, so they will have nothing but powder, and I will guide your arrows." After that, he was often wounded, but never killed in battle. During the final campaign to capture Geronimo and his followers when they escaped from San Carlos, over 5,000 soldiers and another 500 Indian scouts were employed. Among them were the 10th Cavalry Troopers, better known as the Buffalo Soldiers, based at Fort Huachuca in the southeastern corner of the state. The fort was opened by Miles Nelson in 1886 as the advance headquarters and supply base for his Geronimo campaign. They were named Buffalo Soldiers by the Plains Indians, who believed their hair resembled the coat of a buffalo, and since this was a sacred animal, the name was a term of respect. This unit of African American Army troops was formed to fight Native Americans in 1867, and one of their earliest battles in the Arizona Territory was against Geronimo and his holdouts in the Dragoon Mountains in 1885. Later, these African American troops also battled horse thieves and cattle rustlers, as well as Mexican bandits and revolutionaries. Brigadier General Nelson Miles, with his superior military resources, finally convinced Geronimo to surrender on September 3, 1886, at Skeleton Canyon in Arizona. Headlines across America screamed, "Apache War ended." Miles promised Geronimo that his followers would be allowed to return to Arizona after a short exile in Florida, but there, in the damp and malaria-infested cells, 119 of the 498 in the group died. In 1894, the survivors were moved to Oklahoma and asked to, quote, "take the white man's road," end quote, and become farmers. To add insult to injury, many Chiricahua scouts who had located Geronimo and convinced him to surrender, and who had received commendations from President Grover Cleveland, were arrested as prisoners of war and confined to prison in Florida. Two Apache women, Datose and Lozin, the sister of Apache war leader Victoria, were among those scouts. Both had chosen to live their lives as warriors. Lozin never married. She dressed as a man, while Tadotse chose a dual life as wife and mother as well as warrior. Both of these women were skilled warriors who could out-hunt and out-shoot many of their male comrades. And both women rode out to Geronimo and convinced him that it was in his best interest to surrender. Despite their work to help bring in Geronimo, both women were sent to languish in prison in Florida, where Lozin died and Tadotse contracted pneumonia and tuberculosis, but survived. Those who did survive the jail in Florida, including Geronimo and Tadotse, then served in prison at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Geronimo died there in 1909, and he was never allowed to return to his homeland again. Finally, in 1913, the survivors, including Tadotse, were allowed to join the Mescalero Reservation in central New Mexico. As one historian has noted, no other southwestern Indians had been moved so far or been gone for so long. The O'odham, who had been successful, peaceful farmers along the Gila River, also suffered under American rule. For years, they had been the allies of the Europeans. They had helped Father Kino build his missions, had fed thousands of gold seekers from Mexico and the United States. By the 1870s, were selling or trading more than 3 million pounds of wheat a year. They fed the soldiers and their horses, and their irrigation ditches, originally built by the Hohokam, were responsible for providing the site for the fledgling community of Phoenix. They also worked as scouts and fought alongside the American military during the Apache Wars. But beginning in the 1860s, both Mexican and Anglo farmers began diverting the Gila River, seriously depleting the water the O'odham needed to water their fields. The O'odham were removed to a small reservation around the mission San Javier del Bac in 1874 to protect them from the influx of Anglo farmers. A second reservation was formed near Gila Bend in 1882 when it became obvious the first was just too small. But despite formal protests to the United States government, the siphoning off of the flow of water continued. By 1895, this once very successful agricultural tribe was reduced to receiving food rations from the government and were helpless as they watched their lush fields wither and be overtaken once again by the desert. The removal of indigenous people from their ancestral homes to reservations by the United States government was a cataclysmic event. Populations were decimated by disease and famine. People used to refer to Native Americans as the vanishing race, because their numbers were so depleted during the 1800s. However, as the historian Peter Iverson has noted, they are a very resilient people and they have not vanished. In fact, they have survived and adapted to their changing circumstances in many surprising ways. Here are a couple questions to consider after this lecture. How did life change for the native people of Arizona after the arrival of the Americans? Try to give a couple of specific examples. Also, what obstacles faced Americans who desired to develop Arizona's economy?